Hello and welcome to About Books. Today we've come to the Athenaeum in Church Alley in Liverpool, just across the way from the Blue Coat. This is one of the unique places in Liverpool, I think. It's one of the most significant places of cultural exchange in the city. It's been here as such since 1797, and the jewel in the crown surely has to be its library, which is where we're sitting today, housing some 60,000 books and including the William Roscoe collection. So it's a very appropriate place to be talking about the work of one of our greatest playwrights and poets, William Shakespeare. And in particular, a new book that's recently been published called What Happens in Shakespeare's Macbeth. In 2013, the author Nick Buchanan published a unique study guide called What Happens in Shakespeare's King Lear. And we'll come on to why that's unique in just a moment. This year, to coincide really with the anniversary, Nick's brought out a new book, What Happens in Shakespeare's Macbeth. And I'm delighted to say that Nick's with us today to talk about that. Hello, Nick.
Hi, thank you.
I said it was unique. Can we talk, first of all, a little bit about why it's unique and the structure in which you never actually leave the text in order to cross-reference, which I think is one of the great things about this book. Could you say a little bit about how you arrived at that structure?
Sure. I got really interested in reading Shakespeare after school. Indeed, we didn't do any in school, and found many different types of editions that were out there. And they included things like a glossary for arcane words or words which were no longer legal tender. And typically the glossaries were either at the foot of the page or in the back of the book, and the effort of doing that meant that you left the text to do your research. And I wanted to provide a book where that didn't have to be the case, where a person reading the book could see immediately adjacent to the text a glossary and the commentary I would provide around the text as well. So that the notion is that you're fully immersed in the text and saturated in the experience of Shakespeare. I would say as well that in no way am I seeking to explain Shakespeare. Indeed, I try to avoid that word, because what I want to do is lead people to a richer experience of reading Shakespeare, and of course going to the plays as well. But these are books that we're dealing with. So that was important. And in addition to that, I provide a lot of other things throughout the book, which is equally intended to be the finger pointing at the moon of Shakespeare, so that eventually what I've done around it will evaporate and people will be left with a rich experience of Shakespeare himself, you know.
Let's maybe now dig down
Sure.
and into some of those themes. One of your chapters, which is particularly interesting, is on Providence and the Macbeths.
Indeed.
And in that you cite maybe the main themes of the book, of the play. And you mentioned equivocation. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, because Shakespeare's villains are perhaps never quite the villains that are just black and white, that other lesser playwrights might have made them, and that's certainly true in this play. I mean, in a sense, you could say that this is a play in which you have two villains, which is unusual for a start, and yet those two villains are not totally evil in any sense. Could you say a little bit about that?
Of course. I mean, I think you're right. I think Macbeth is unique because it has a double act of villains. Sigmund Freud used to say that Macbeth and his lady were two parts of the same personality. But in reality, their personalities, I think, are quite different, and I don't think it's helpful to say that they're two parts of the same personality. And their journeys are very different throughout the play. Macbeth is often portrayed as this butcher who simply hacks a path towards the crown and slays anyone in his way. But in the play, he's not that person at all. He's a very valiant soldier who's certainly courageous in battle, but when it comes to hacking friends to pieces, he's incredibly conflicted and really doesn't want to go through with it. He likes the end result. He wants the crown. It's a bit like somebody who wants to play the piano but doesn't want to do any of the lessons or learn the thing. They just want to be able to do that thing. And in Macbeth, that's certainly the case. And he is incredibly reticent at the start and is full of trepidation about the implications of it and what it will mean for him as a human being, and even in a godly world, what the eternal implications are is certainly mentioned in the play. So he's full of trepidation. His wife, by contrast, is quite matter-of-fact and practical about this. This is what we need to do to get where we need to get to. And she famously says, a little water clears us of this deed. And she thinks that's the end of it, really, that you can do that and you can move on. He actually says, in a very beautiful scene that I can't quote, but he says that if he were to wash his hands in all of great Neptune's oceans, then rather than his hands become clean, the whole oceans of the world would turn red. A very, very powerful, and it turns out, accurate portrayal of what's going to happen, because, of course, as his journey unfolds, he becomes more comfortable with the killings, to the point where he actually says that he's so far stepped in blood that to go forwards is the same as returning. So he may as well carry on and hack on. Whereas she famously becomes... So he becomes more brazen, and his journey is from a troubled conscience to an easier conscience. Hers is from a much easier conscience to a troubled conscience, to the point where she's destroyed psychologically.
You mentioned the journey that they both go on, and in a sense, I suppose the one of the engines of this story is embarking on a course of action that, having begun it, you can't stop.
Yes, well, there is a relentlessness about the whole of Macbeth, I think. And I think even without the Middleton part, it would be even tighter. But this relentless journey, the arc of the demise, is so powerful and singular. It's quite unlike any other Shakespeare play. I mean, in a play like King Lear, which is another great tragedy, and there is a relentless path. There's the offsetting because of the subplot with Gloucester and Edmund and Edgar. And there are these other things in different colours. But Macbeth is incredibly relentless. And he's different to the other characters because of that conscience. A lot of Shakespeare villains, like Richard III or Iago, they don't really demonstrate a great deal of trepidation, reflection. It's a quite straightforward journey. But Macbeth is, in the initial stages, a very conflicted character, and conscience bothers him. In terms of equivocation, because I should have picked up on that, the notion of equivocation came about and was underlined and emphasised because there was a priest called Father Garnet in 1595. He wrote a treatise, which was a treatise on equivocation. And really, as a Catholic priest, it was an instructive tract, really, for Catholics in England at the time who were persecuted and often threatened with the death penalty. He wrote this treatise to give them a sanction, a license, if you like, to, under the duress of interrogation, to be very ambiguous in their answers. In a way, it was about allowing people to lie under duress or a threat of torture. And this was known as equivocation, to be able to say one thing but secretly know another. And that's really at the heart of Macbeth. Indeed, Lady Macbeth says, "Look like the flower, but be the serpent under it." And King Duncan says, that there's no art to... I'm trying to think what he says now. There's no art to... There's no art can find the mind's construction in the face. And I think this business of reading what rightly is the case or isn't the case, and equivocation being a deliberate concealing of something and being something else. This is really at the heart of the play, where fair is foul and foul is fair, and where opposites go together. Just mentioning the witches then, another thing worth mentioning about the idea that Middleton may have written it is actually from the witches, in that they always speak in this very peculiar 7-syllable language with by the pricking of my thumbs, and 7, something wicked this way comes. And all of the things they say in Shakespeare's parlance is in that odd language. It's 7 syllables, but it's also 4 beats. So you've got like, when shall we 3 meet again? Although it's 7 syllables, there's 4 stresses in there. And they're what make their language peculiar. And in the Hecate scene, they just talk iambic pentameter, and there's no peculiarity. And one thing I've noticed in Shakespeare is that when he changes from prose to verse, or from iambic to this thing called trochaic tetrameter, there's always a reason. It's a different tone of voice. There's a difference in atmosphere. So in King Lear, when Lear is dividing up his kingdom, the courtly, this is done in a very formal verse, whereas where characters are speaking to one another in a more informal setting, it often might be something like a blank verse or just ordinary prose.
In many ways, the illusion, the illusory trap that
Yes.
Macbeth falls into, is linked to that ambition. That is, I mean, as Paul Simon said, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest.
Absolutely.
And Macbeth definitely does that.
He does.
And it brings us back, I suppose, to the witches again, and the question of, and you raise this point very beautifully in the book, I think, the question of whether the witches foretell or compel.
Indeed. And it is a huge issue because I think some commentators on Macbeth afford the witches far too much power, and they miss out the human agency part. And I think it's very interesting if you look at the witches and they describe their activities throughout the play. One witch early on talks about how she met this fat woman. She calls her a runyon, and this woman had some chestnuts, and the witch asked her for a chestnut, and the woman said no, and the witch then decided to curse the situation, and she knew her father was going to pilot a boat. It was actually a ship called the Tiger to Aleppo, a place in Syria. And she provided winds and rain and hail so that he could never dock his ship and would die eventually of starvation and thirst. And this seems to be the agency of the witches, that they can't just kill the man directly, but they're involved in providing circumstances through which he would eventually die. And in Macbeth's situation, in his case, they obviously play into his greed, his avarice, if you like, his desire, his lust for the crown, his lust for power, and that really, as you have said, provides an engine really for that.
Let's talk a bit about the supernatural aspect
Sure.
of this play. I mean, as in a number of Shakespeare's plays, the supernatural plays a key role in Hamlet. The
indeed.
supernatural makes things happen. Again, it's that engine. I'm trying to think myself back into Shakespeare's time in the context in which these plays were written, and I wonder what you think about that and the role of the supernatural as it would have been, say, perceived in Shakespeare's time.
Sure. Well, I think the whole issue of witches and demons was a huge issue in Shakespeare's time, and particularly the time he wrote Macbeth. He wrote Macbeth around 1606, which is the exact year that Father Garnet was tried and killed. And they mocked him at his trial, saying, "Would you like to equivocate now?" And he was tried as being one of the plotters of the gunpowder plot, but it was very flimsy evidence, and so there's a lot of fear and a lot of superstition in that society. Indeed, King James, who was on the throne at the time of Macbeth, had written a book himself on demonology, which was warning people against witchcraft and the ills of incantations and people inviting spirits. So it was a very common thing, and people were being tried and executed for being witches. And of course, this went on even later in Massachusetts, in Salem, much later in the 1600s. So it's not that long ago, really. But there was this superstitious feeling and atmosphere. I would actually more closely ally it to McCarthyism than anything else. I think it's no coincidence that a playwright like Arthur Miller would set a play about McCarthyism back in the Salem witch hunts of the 1600s in Massachusetts, because there are similarities, and it was a society where people could tell on other people, particularly if you were Catholic or had those kind of leanings, and who knows what might happen to you. People were tortured and died on account of claiming a certain faith. So witches and demonology were there, and Shakespeare was ever the populist in a way, in that he tapped into this in writing his play, and pleased the king, just as he pleased the same king in writing King Lear. In King Lear, he showed the ills of a king having a divided kingdom. And of course, James I wanted to bring the kingdoms together and unite Scotland and England. So Shakespeare was a smart cookie at the same time.
Yeah. Well, we've touched on this before, but I'd like to come back to it. Is at heart Macbeth an evil man? I mean, he commits evil, but is there a difference?
Yes.
And this I suppose, links to a question, and we're coming to the end of our conversation now, but I think that the big question that is raised so often in Shakespeare's plays, that the text answers every time, is the relevance to us that we find in these plays. And do you have to be an evil person to commit evil?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think Macbeth is too easily dismissed as an evil person. Anthony Sher said a really good thing a while ago, that the great thing about Shakespeare is that when he shows us characters, he never says, "Look at him over there, isn't he bad, isn't he awful?" He always says, "That's us, that's you, that's me, that's us," because the possibilities for us all to behave in ways that are inhuman are actually intrinsic to the human condition. It only takes a certain type of circumstance to do that. And I don't think Macbeth is intrinsically evil. I think he ends up doing evil things, and they're dreadful things and appalling things. But I wouldn't say that it's about evil. And interestingly enough, I think all of Shakespeare's plays encourage us to examine the antithesis. So a play like Othello, which is all about jealousy, is also by virtue about trust. And it can't help but be about trust, because that's really a key thing here if we're talking about jealousy. What is trust? If we look at Hamlet, much of Hamlet is about death and mortality. But then it's about life and living. And what is life about? How do we live life? What's meaningful in life, King Lear is about seeming and about concealments. And then, of course, it's about authenticity and the authentic human being, So although Macbeth is about evil, it can't really be about evil unless we have a sense of what is good. And we could have a big discussion about that, because we could bump into theological things. But I think that within us there is a compass about good. in that we may vary about what is good in broad terms in societies and cultural differences, but we know that it's wrong to kill someone, and that seems to be quite intrinsic to our human nature, so that conscience is a very difficult thing to overcome. Indeed, in a very early Mad comic produced by EC Comics, Alfred E. Newman, the great character, had a quote in one of them that said, "Conscience is that part of us that hurts when everything else is so good." And I think that's ultimately what Macbeth finds on his journey, in that conscience is not so easily dismissed.
Nick, it's a fascinating book, as of course is King Lear, and a vast amount of work in these books. I mean, where do you go now? What's next?
Well, I'm writing a book, another guide in the series. I always wanted them to be a series, and I always wanted to tackle, first and foremost, the four great tragedies. So I'm working on Hamlet at the moment, and finding new things in it for me, at least, and it's so relevant to today. I mean, you know, we mentioned in King Lear that they talk about this glib and oily art. Well, that's what spin is, you know, to speak and purpose not, to just say what we'll do and then not do those things. And words seem very cheap, but, you know, obviously, the instruction, I think, is to measure people by what they do, not by just what they say. So I think, you know, Shakespeare is ever relevant, and I'm finding that more and more with Hamlet as well. And I'm moved by the words, I'm caught by it all, and it's such a delightful experience that my aim is simply to share that. If I can encourage somebody to have a direct individual contact with Shakespeare, then I will have done my job well.
Well, you've certainly done it well in this book. What Happens in Shakespeare's Macbeth by Nick Buchanan is out now. I can thoroughly recommend it. Nick, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Likewise, Sean. It always is.
And from this edition of About Books, bye-bye.